I never thought I'd hear his voice again. Not after the way he threw me out. Not after the things he said. Not after making it clear that I was nothing more than a disappointment to him. But 5 years after my father disowned me, he called me out of nowhere, like time was supposed to erase everything. I was sitting in my apartment when my phone vibrated on the table. I barely glanced at it until I saw the name, Dad. At first, I thought it had to be a mistake, maybe a wrong number or some ghost of a past contact resurfacing on my screen. But the phone kept ringing. My fingers hesitated over the decline button, but something in me, curiosity, anger, maybe just sheer disbelief, made me answer instead. For a moment, there was nothing but silence. Then, a voice I never thought I'd hear again. Michael. His tone was unfamiliar, rough, like he had swallowed a handful of nails. I need your help. I nearly laughed at the absurdity of it. My father, Richard Calloway, a man who prided himself on being untouchable, a man who once looked me in the eye and said I was dead to him, was now calling me like we were just two people catching up. I should have hung up. I should have told him to go to hell. Instead, I leaned forward, gripping the phone tighter. You need my help? I repeated, unable to keep the disbelief out of my voice. Last I checked, I wasn't even your son anymore. A long pause. I could hear his breathing, slow and controlled, the same way it had always been when he was thinking. Then, finally, he spoke again. I'm dying. The words settled between us, heavy and suffocating. I should have felt something, grief, sadness, anger, but all I felt was numbness. The last time we had spoken, he had told me I was a disgrace to the Calloway name, that I had humiliated him by rejecting my place in the family firm. I walked away that night with nothing but the clothes on my back and the weight of his words digging into my spine. And now, after all these years, he expected me to care? That's unfortunate, I said, my voice emotionless. He let out a breath, something between a sigh and a quiet frustration. I don't expect your sympathy, Michael. I know I don't deserve it, but there's something I need to set right before I go, and you're the only one who can help me do it. I exhaled through my nose, closing my eyes for a second. And what exactly do you need? The firm is in trouble. His voice was weaker now, like it physically hurt him to say those words. Calloway and Sons is barely holding together. I don't have the strength to fix it. I need you to come back, to take over. I let out a sharp, humorless laugh. So let me get this straight. You cut me off, threw me away, made it clear that I meant nothing to you. But now that your precious firm is falling apart, I'm suddenly worth calling? It's more complicated than that. It really isn't. Michael, please. That single word made my breath catch. My father had never begged for anything in his life. Hearing him say it now, after everything, felt unnatural. I'll think about it, I said, and before he could respond, I hung up. I sat there for a long time, staring at my phone, my heart pounding even though I wasn't sure why. I told myself that I wasn't considering it, that I had just said those words to end the conversation, but deep down, I knew the truth. I wasn't done with my father, and he sure as hell wasn't done with me. For the next 3 days, I ignored every call from him, every voicemail, every attempt he made to reach me. But his words kept replaying in my head. I'm dying. The firm is in trouble. I need you. No matter how much I tried to push it aside, I couldn't. It wasn't about him. It wasn't about proving anything. It was about the firm. Calloway and Sons had been in my family for generations, passed down from father to son like some sacred obligation. I had spent my entire childhood knowing exactly what my life was supposed to look like. Law school, working under my father, eventually inheriting the empire he built. But I had never wanted it. I wanted something different, something that didn't come with expectations and suffocating rules. And when I walked away from all of it, my father made it clear that I was making a choice, either be a Calloway or be nothing. And now, after all these years, he was asking me to come back? I had built a life without him. A simple life. Maybe, but a good one. I didn't need his money, his approval, or his firm. But the more I thought about it, the more I realized that this wasn't just about saving Calloway and Sons. It was about something else. A chance to finally take control. On the 4th day, I picked up the phone and called him. He answered on the first ring. You took your time, he said, his voice weaker than before. I want full access to the financials, I said, cutting straight to the point. No lies, no missing information. If you want me to even consider stepping in, I need to know exactly what I'm walking into. A pause. Then, a slow exhale. Fine. I'll have Margaret send them over. I hesitated for just a second before speaking again. I'm not doing this for you. I know. I ended the call and set my phone down, staring at the screen for a long moment. I was going back. 2 days later, I stood outside the Callaway & Sons building for the first time in 5 years. It looked the same, towering glass, polished stone, the family name etched into the entrance in bold letters. But something about it felt different. Maybe because I was different. The last time I walked through these doors, I was still trying to prove to my father that I was worth something. This time, I wasn't here for him. I was here because I wanted to see for myself just how bad things had gotten. The receptionist barely glanced up as I stepped inside, her fingers moving over the keyboard with practiced efficiency. Name? Michael Callaway. Her hands froze for just a second before she looked up properly, taking me in like she wasn't sure whether to believe it. After a moment, she nodded toward the elevators. They're expecting you. I made my way up to the top floor, ignoring the way my pulse quickened slightly as the doors opened to the executive offices. The layout hadn't changed. Same marble floors, same cold, pristine atmosphere. But there was something missing. The usual buzz of activity, the quiet hum of conversations behind closed doors, it wasn't there. The place felt hollow. Margaret was waiting for me just outside my father's office, a tablet in her hands, her expression unreadable. She had been my father's assistant for as long as I could remember, and if she was surprised to see me, she didn't show it. He's inside, she said, stepping aside. I pushed the door open without knocking. My father sat behind his desk, looking smaller than I remembered. The man who had once commanded entire rooms with just a glance now looked like he barely had the strength to sit upright. His suit was still perfectly tailored, but his skin was paler, his frame thinner. He had aged more in 5 years than I would have thought possible. You actually came, he said, his voice quieter than usual but still carrying that same measured tone, like he was analyzing my every move. You sent the reports, I said, dropping the folder onto his desk. I read them. This firm is worse off than you let on. He didn't react. You were always good at seeing through things. You should have told me the full truth from the start. And would that have changed your decision? I didn't answer. We both knew it wouldn't have. I pulled out the chair across from him and sat down, keeping my posture rigid. Tell me what you've already tried. For the next hour, he laid everything out. The failed attempts to bring in new investors, the desperate negotiations with old clients, the restructuring plans that had gone nowhere. The more he talked, the clearer it became. He had been fighting to keep this firm alive for years, long before he ever called me. You're out of options, I said once he had finished. He exhaled slowly, nodding. That's why you're here. I leaned forward slightly, resting my forearms on the desk. If I do this, I do it my way. No interference. No second-guessing. I won't be your puppet. His expression didn't change, but I caught the slight tension in his jaw. He didn't like giving up control. Fine. I didn't believe him. Not yet. Margaret stepped into the room then, holding another folder. The board is waiting. I pushed back my chair and stood. My father didn't move, just watched me carefully as I made my way to the door. Michael, he said just before I stepped out. I glanced back. You'll need to be ruthless. I held his gaze for a second longer before walking out without a word. The boardroom was full when I entered. The senior partners seated around the long table, their conversations dying down the second they saw me. Some of them looked surprised, others skeptical. Simmons, one of the longest-serving partners, leaned back in his chair with a quiet sigh. So, he said, folding his hands together, the prodigal son returns. I ignored the comment and took the seat at the head of the table. Let's not waste time. You all know why I'm here. One of the younger partners, a man I didn't recognize, glanced between me and the others. With all due respect, Mr. Callaway, why should we believe you can fix this? You walked away from the firm years ago. You never even finished law school. What makes you qualified to run this company? I didn't blink. Because I'm the only one left who can. Simmons let out a quiet laugh, shaking his head. That's not an answer. Then here's one, I said, my tone sharp. This firm is collapsing because it refused to change. Because my father held on to clients who outgrew their contracts. Because he built this place on reputation rather than adaptability. You're not looking at a leadership problem, you're looking at a survival problem. And right now, survival means doing things differently. If you don't like that, you're welcome to leave. A silence settled over the room. Some of them looked annoyed, others intrigued. Simmons studied me for a moment before finally nodding. All right, Michael, what's your plan? I pulled the reports out of my folder and set them on the table. We start by stopping the bleeding. That means client retention. I want a full breakdown of every major client who left in the last 18 months, who they went to, why they left, and whether there's a way to bring them back. That report needs to be on my desk by tomorrow morning. One of the other partners, a woman in her late 40s, tapped her pen against the table. And after that? After that, we rebuild, I said, leaning back, but one step at a time. The room was quiet for a few seconds before Simmons nodded again. You've got 2 weeks. If we don't see progress, we reconsider. Fair enough. The meeting ended shortly after, and I made my way back to my office. Margaret was already there, sorting through another pile of reports. She barely glanced up as I entered. You made an impression, she said. Good or bad? A mix, she admitted. But at least they're listening. I sat down at my desk, exhaling slowly. How bad is the client loss? She handed me another folder. Bad, but not irreversible. Caldwell is still waiting for a second meeting. If you can bring him back, others might follow. I nodded, flipping through the names. Set it up. She didn't argue, just turned and walked out, leaving me alone with the weight of what I had just done. I had taken my first step into my father's world. Now, I had to prove I could survive in it. The second meeting with Caldwell was set for the next morning, and I spent most of the night going over every possible angle. If we lost this deal, it would send a message to every other client that Callaway & Sons wasn't worth saving. Caldwell didn't just represent money. He represented credibility, stability, the illusion that this firm could still be trusted. Without him, the cracks would only widen, and I wasn't sure how much longer I could hold everything together before the whole thing collapsed. Margaret handed me the final contract as we stepped into the car. She had been efficient as always, gathering everything I needed without waiting for me to ask. Caldwell will be waiting in his private office. He already knows what you're going to offer. If he says no this time, it's final. I nodded, scanning the contract again, even though I had already memorized every word. What's his biggest hesitation? He doesn't trust us to stay afloat, she said, adjusting the files in her lap. And he has every reason to feel that way. Then I need to convince him that I'm not my father. Margaret glanced at me for a second, then turned back to her notes. We'll see if he believes that. The car pulled up to the glass building, and I stepped out without hesitation. Caldwell's assistant was already waiting, leading us up the elevator and into a sleek, minimalist office with floor-to-ceiling windows. Alan Caldwell was seated behind a massive desk, his expression unreadable as he gestured for me to sit. You're persistent, he said, closing a folder on his desk. I'll give you that. I wouldn't be here if I wasn't. He leaned back, folding his hands together. Let's not waste time. The only reason I agreed to this meeting is because I'm curious. Convince me why I should trust Callaway & Sons again. I placed the contract on his desk, but didn't open it. I'm not going to waste your time with empty promises. You already know what's happened to the firm. You've seen the numbers, you've seen the clients walking away, and you're wondering if signing with us now would just be delaying the inevitable. I get that. Caldwell didn't react, waiting for me to continue. But here's the thing, I said, leaning forward slightly. If Callaway & Sons collapses, you lose too. You've worked with this firm for over a decade. You know how we operate, how we handle your business, how we protect your interests. If you go somewhere else, you're starting over. You'll be working with people who don't know you, who don't anticipate your needs the way we do. That's a risk too. Caldwell exhaled slowly. And what exactly are you offering to make that risk worth taking? Better terms, I said, finally opening the folder. A more flexible contract, one that adjusts to your company's needs instead of locking you into something that doesn't work anymore. I'm not my father, Caldwell. I don't run things the way he did. I'm offering you a deal that actually benefits both of us. He glanced over the contract, his fingers tapping lightly against the desk. Margaret remained silent beside me, watching his every move. After a long pause, Caldwell closed the folder and nodded. I'll sign on one condition. I kept my expression neutral. Name it. I want proof that this firm isn't just buying time, he said. I want to know that you're not just another desperate businessman trying to patch up a sinking ship. I met his gaze without hesitation. Give me 60 days. If I can't turn things around by then, I'll release you from the contract. No penalties, no complications. You'll be free to walk away. Caldwell studied me for a moment longer, then finally nodded. All right, Calloway. You've got 60 days. He signed the contract, and I shook his hand, ignoring the weight pressing against my chest. I had won this round, but the hardest part was still ahead. Back at the office, Margaret set the signed contract on my desk, watching me carefully. You just made a deal with an expiration date. I know. She crossed her arms. If you fail, it won't just be Caldwell leaving. Everyone else will follow. I know. Margaret sighed, shaking her head. Then I hope you have a plan. I didn't answer right away, just looked down at the contract, feeling the full weight of the decision I had just made. 60 days. That was all I had. And failure wasn't an option. The 60-day countdown started the moment Caldwell signed. I didn't waste time. The next morning, I had every department head in the conference room, charts and reports spread across the table, the tension in the air thick enough to suffocate. Half the people in that room still weren't sure if they trusted me. The other half were waiting for me to fail. I didn't care about either. The firm is on life support, I said, keeping my tone sharp. We have 60 days to prove we're worth saving, or we close the doors for good. If you're here expecting things to stay the same, leave now. We don't have time for that. No one moved, but I saw the subtle shifts. Glances exchanged, arms crossed, the unspoken challenge in the room. Simmons, always the first to voice skepticism, leaned back in his chair. And what exactly is your brilliant plan, Calloway? I flipped open a file and pushed it toward him. Client retention. Caldwell's deal is done, but one contract won't fix this. We need to win back the others who walked away. We start with the ones who haven't officially signed elsewhere. I want personal meetings scheduled with every major client we lost in the last 18 months. No emails, no middlemen. Face to face. One of the younger partners frowned. Some of them left because they lost trust in your father. What makes you think they'll trust you? They don't have to trust me, I said, meeting his gaze. They just have to trust that Calloway & Sons is still the best option. Silence. No arguments. Just quiet understanding that this was our only real shot. Margaret, sitting off to the side, tapped her pen against her notepad. And what about the internal mess? The firm has been bleeding money for years. Even if we bring clients back, we can't afford the same structure. I nodded. We restructure. Any position that isn't directly tied to revenue or client services is under review. If it's not essential, it's gone. Simmons scoffed, shaking his head. You're talking about layoffs. I'm talking about survival, I corrected. We either cut the weight that's dragging us down, or we all go down with it. The room was silent again, but this time, there was no skepticism. Just the cold reality of what needed to be done. Over the next few weeks, the office turned into a battlefield. I met with every client we had lost, listened to their complaints, their frustrations, their reasons for leaving. Some were willing to renegotiate, cautiously testing the waters to see if Calloway & Sons was still worth their time. Others walked out without looking back. I didn't chase them. I focused on the ones who were willing to listen. The internal restructuring was brutal. Positions were cut, entire departments were reevaluated, and the people who had spent years growing comfortable under my father's rule realized that things were changing whether they liked it or not. Some of the older partners resisted, clinging to the way things had always been done, but I didn't let them slow me down. The moment someone became a problem, they were out. I wasn't here to protect egos. I was here to keep the firm alive. Through it all, My father barely spoke to me. He still came to the office, still sat in his chair like he was waiting for something, but he didn't interfere. He just watched. I didn't know what he was thinking, and I didn't ask. By the time we hit the 50-day mark, progress was visible. New contracts were being signed, costs were being slashed, and for the first time in years, the firm wasn't actively losing money. It wasn't a victory yet, but it was proof that we weren't dead. Not yet. That night, I was in my office going through numbers when my father walked in. He didn't knock, didn't ask if I had time. He just stood there, looking around like he was seeing the place for the first time. "You fired Simmons," he said. I didn't look up from my papers. He was slowing us down. He was loyal. He was useless. A pause. Then, quietly, "You sound like me." I finally looked up, meeting his gaze. "I'm nothing like you." He exhaled through his nose, something almost resembling a laugh. "You're making the same choices I would have." I leaned back in my chair, crossing my arms. "The difference is, I'm doing it to fix your mistakes." He nodded slowly, as if accepting that. "And if it's not enough?" I held his gaze. "Then Callaway and Sons dies with you." For the first time, something in his expression shifted, something I couldn't quite place. Not regret, not anger, just understanding. He turned and walked out without another word. I sat there for a long time after he left, staring at the papers in front of me. 50 days left. Failure wasn't an option. The last 30 days were a war. I barely slept, barely ate, barely had time to think about anything other than the numbers that decided whether Callaway and Sons lived or died. The contracts we had salvaged weren't enough. We needed more. I met with investors, renegotiated deals, cut every unnecessary expense I could find. Every day was a fight to keep the firm above water, and I had no time for hesitation. The people who had doubted me in the beginning weren't questioning me anymore. The senior partners who had resisted my decisions either adjusted or left. Those who remained knew the truth. We were still one wrong move away from collapsing. The staff worked like they understood it too. Everyone could feel it. We were either about to pull off a miracle or sink for good. My father still came in every morning, still sat in his office watching everything unfold, but he didn't speak to me again. Sometimes, I'd catch him staring at the old company portraits on the wall, the framed newspaper articles from the firm's glory days, as if trying to hold on to something that had already slipped through his fingers. He had spent his entire life building this firm, controlling every piece of it, and now, he had no choice but to watch as someone else took over. With 10 days left, I reviewed the financials and knew the truth. The firm wasn't failing anymore. It wasn't thriving, but it was stable. It would survive. Barely. On the final day of the 60-day deal, Caldwell walked into my office without knocking, dropping a fresh contract onto my desk. "You pulled it off." I didn't pretend to be surprised. Was there ever a doubt? "Yes," he said without hesitation, sitting down across from me. "But you proved me wrong. I'm extending our deal long-term. You earned it." I picked up the contract and scanned it, already knowing I'd sign. This was what I had fought for. Proof that Callaway and Sons could stand on its own. Proof that I had been right to come back. But as I looked at the papers, I felt nothing. Not relief. Not victory. Not satisfaction. Nothing. That night, long after everyone had gone home, I sat alone in my office, staring at the firm I had just saved. The firm that had cost me years of my life, that had driven a wedge between me and my father, that had been the source of every expectation and disappointment I had ever known. I had spent months trying to keep it alive. Now, for the first time, I asked myself if I wanted to. The answer came faster than I expected. The next morning, I walked into my father's office for the last time. He looked up, already knowing why I was there. I placed the Caldwell contract in front of him. "The firm is stable now. You got what you wanted." He stared at the papers for a long time before looking back at me. "And what do you want?" I didn't hesitate. To walk away. His eyes searched my face, and for the first time in my life, I saw something I had never seen before. Not disappointment, not anger, just understanding. "You don't have to be me," he said quietly. I nodded. "I know." I left Callaway and Sons that day. I didn't pack my office, didn't say goodbye to anyone. I just walked out the same way I had 5 years ago. Except this time, I wasn't running away. I was choosing something else. My father died 3 weeks later. There were no final words, no dramatic reconciliation, just silence. At the funeral, former colleagues talked about his success, his legacy, the firm he had built from the ground up. No one mentioned how much it had cost him. No one mentioned that, in the end, it had cost him everything. I listened, but I didn't speak. I never reopened the firm. I never tried to rebuild what was lost. I had spent my entire life trying to prove that I wasn't my father, but in the end, the only thing that mattered was making sure I didn't become him. Not every legacy is worth saving. Sometimes, the strongest thing you can do is let go.